Over the past 5 years or so, NES Works has been tracing the rebirth of the American console industry, following its flameout in the early 80s.
You guys are finished! Drop it!
Nintendo saw an opportunity to step into a devastated marketplace and fill the void that existed between consumer desires and retailer ambivalence. Not only was the company rewarded for its efforts with a 5-year run as the leader of a resurgent industry, the NES's success in the world's largest retail economy ensured that console gaming would continue to thrive on a global scale. The NES helped spark a renaissance. Yet Nintendo wasn't out there alone. Even if the NES hadn't come along, video games would have made a comeback in America. It's what people wanted. Several other companies were poised to take the top slot even if Nintendo had shied away from the task, with perfectly capable consoles of their own. So what about those other companies? I've come to realize that with its heavy emphasis on context and precedent to better define the design and place in history of each game covered, the overall VideoWorks project is not just about Nintendo's NES or Game Boy. It's about the rise of the modern console industry in the US, as well as the advent of portable gaming. That rise began in New York City in October 1985 when Nintendo tested the waters with the NES, but Nintendo, again, wasn't out there alone. Not only did the company's third-party licensees play a major role in the industry's renewal, so too did the company's competition. This story simply can't be complete without taking the time to survey Nintendo's competition, something I've only occasionally dabbled in. That will change beginning now as I bring proper clarity to VideoWorks. The NES and Game Boy, and Super NES, will remain the central focus of this project. But in order to better tell their story, I'll be doing with NES Works Gaiden what you've already seen a bit of in Game Boy Works Gaiden: overviews of competing systems to provide greater context for the NES. It's all well and good to say, this game was like nothing before it, but getting a direct sense of what else was actually out there will help better define the strengths and weaknesses of these systems. And there's no more appropriate place to begin than with, once again, an Atari system that hit the market around the same time as Nintendo's. Just as Lynx debuted in America within weeks of Game Boy's debut, the Atari 7800 Pro system launched in America before Nintendo had completed its full national rollout. Most contemporary publications have it down as launching in May 1986, a month before the accepted nationwide launch for the NES. In reality, the 7800 is a much older system than that. It was Atari's first console to have been designed after the Japanese launch of the Famicom, and as such it was directly competitive with the Famicom in terms of power. Which is to say that, like the NES, it was also a bit dated by the time it hit the US market. This makes the 7800 a transitional system of sorts, bridging the divide between the pre- and post-crash realities of the US games industry. Atari originally intended to launch the system in July 1984, but the month before that happened, Jack Tramiel took full control of his half of the company, the hardware biz, and put the kibosh on it. For 2 years, rumors circulated in the press of the lost Atari system, collecting dust in a warehouse somewhere, never to see the light of day. When the NES test launch demonstrated that game enthusiasts were still, in fact, enthusiastic about games, Atari Inc. realized, hey, we have just the thing sitting on pallets somewhere. They announced a national rollout of the 7800 at Winter CES 1986, and within a few months had 100,000 shiny silver boxes sitting on store shelves, ready to compete with Nintendo. What they didn't have, unfortunately, was the software to follow. As we saw with Lynx, Atari's initial lineup played to the company's strengths, its arcade heritage, but that made it somewhat one-note by comparison to Nintendo's extensive lineup of not only arcade conversions but also big adventures, shooting games, sports titles, and weird robot novelties. Still, 7800 may not have had the massive library of the NES at launch. 9 games were available for it through the end of 1986 compared to NES's 3 dozen, but those games were familiar properties rendered effectively. For fans of the golden age of arcades who had been hoping for convincing home conversions of their favorites, the 7800 fit the bill, creating a bit of an age divide between console audiences. The colorful, cartoonish visuals of Nintendo's new properties and games like Chubby Cherub were perfectly suited to younger players who may have missed out on the heyday of the arcade 5 years earlier. But for more seasoned gamers who had come of age with a case of Pac-Man fever, 7800 made a convincing pitch. Although 7800's precise chronology is pretty murky, Atari archive creator Kevin Bunch has done considerable research poring over old newspaper archives and through reports in contemporary publications like The Computer Entertainer to piece together a solid timeline of 7800 games. This run of Gaiden episodes will be using Kevin's work as the basis of a journey through the 7800's 5 dozen releases. As with Game Boy Works Gaiden, I'll be covering 4 or 5 games per entry, and once we catch up with the current NES chronology, the 12 games released for 7800 through the end of 1987, these episodes will show up from time to time, as is appropriate, within the ongoing NES chronology. For now, we're jumping back to May 1986, which puts us shortly before the beginning of NES Works 1986, to look at 4 of the releases available at 7800's May 86 launch. And the usual production note. Atari 7800 episodes are currently recorded from the 7800 core of a jailbroken analog NT Mini, upscaled through a Mecom Soft FrameMeister, though I do intend to integrate an actual 7800 with S-Video mod into the mix soon. Please look forward to it, as they say. As with all the 7800's initial wave of releases, its Pac-Man title hails from the arcades of the early 80s, Namco's Pole Position 2. The 7800 wouldn't see a proper selection of newly created games arrive until 1988 because the console had been on ice since '84, and once Atari decided to thaw it, developers needed a little time to get up to speed on the hardware and get their processes in gear. Everything initially available for 7800 in May 1986 was software that had been produced with the intent of going out with the national launch in 1984, and had been mothballed along with the machine. Pole Position 2 is the perfect embodiment of that reality. Like every other launch game, it has a 1984 copyright on its title screen, and it would have made a stunning home release had it arrived then. No other home console available in '84 in the US could offer a racing game with this level of quality. The visuals, speed, and controls would have been simply impossible on ColecoVision or Atari 5200, to say nothing of the 2600 or Intellivision. For that matter, Pole Position 2 compares favorably to NES's offerings too. Nintendo initially announced their console would ship alongside a game called Nintendo 500, which almost certainly would have been HAL's F1 Race, but that never materialized. Like Pole Position 2, F1 Race was a Formula 1 style game with a behind-the-car perspective, which it probably owed to the original Pole Position. But with Nintendo 500 never materializing, the first NES racing game to take this form would be Rad Racer, which wouldn't ship in the US until late 1987. Pole Position 2 is a fairly convincing, if limited, racer. The game presents you with 3 different racetracks, plus a trial track, and you can choose from any of them at the outset. These are somewhat accurate recreations of real Japanese tracks, such as Suzuka, though the renderings here aren't quite as spot on as those of the arcade game. Then again, Pole Position 2 on 7800 is a step down from the arcade game in general, with slightly more limited and washed out colors and reduced detail. It looks good, but it's not arcade perfect. It's attractive to see in motion nonetheless, with fast and fairly smooth road action. It handles and controls well. Your car has 2 gears, high and low, and you need to learn when to up and downshift in order to avoid a wipeout. Hitting another car, clipping a roadside sign, or even driving into a puddle at the wrong angle will detonate your car and cost you precious time. Your goal is to complete several laps on each course and come in ahead of the other racers. But as with the original Pole Position, there's a time factor here as well. You need to cross the goal line before the unit time runs down, or you'll game over regardless of your current position in the race. The one somewhat annoying aspect of this game is that every time you race, you have to complete a qualifying lap before you can leap into the race proper. The qualifying lap determines your starting position, so it can be advantageous if you manage to place in the top 4, as it gives you a huge jump on the competition. But it would be nice if there were an option to just race without having to do the whole Gran Turismo thing. Still, as Pac-Mans go, Pole Position 2 gets the point across. This is a console about solid arcade conversions. A bit dated perhaps, but still convincing.
Like the system's Pac-Man, the 7800's very first retail release that we're going to look at is also a Namco arcade classic, one from the golden age, Dig Dug.
By 1986, Dig Dug was well-trodden territory. A classic to be sure, but players were honestly spoiled for choice when it came to home conversions. Still, the 7800 version does compare favorably to every US console and computer release that had preceded it. It's more colorful, with more detailed sprites, and more accurate music. As in every version of the game, you play a little underground explorer, whose name we now realize is Taizo Hori, who tunnels through the earth as he moves. 2 kinds of monsters lurk in the underground, wandering pukas and fire-breathing Figars. Your task is to destroy these rabble by hitting them with a spear gun and then inflating them until they explode. It's kind of morbid, but whimsical at the same time. The gameplay makes a number of different stratagems available. When surrounded by monsters, you can inflate one part way to stun it and turn your attention to another. You can fire your spear through thin tunnel walls that monsters can't pass through. And the game's naive gravity and perspective means you can move in all directions around the screen, even if it appears to be up, but when you dislodge the dirt beneath a rock, it'll plummet to the bottom and crush anything in its way. Monsters have a few tricks up their monster sleeves, too. They can become ghost-like, drifting through untunneled soil as they home in on Taizo to trap him in a pincer maneuver, and a Figar's flame will penetrate thin tunnel walls just like Taizo's spear. This port captures all of that very well, but it's not quite as close to the real thing as Namco's own Nintendo conversion, though that ended up not mattering here since Namco never released the NES port of Dig Dug in the US. We jump straight ahead to Dig Dug 2, meaning that until Namco Museum came along 10 years later, the Atari 7800 version of Dig Dug was probably the most faithful home port of the game in the US, unless I'm overlooking something that came later. You can kind of see why the NES version never came over from Japan. Dig Dug is a timeless classic, but even timeless works have to weather that period of time where they're too recent to be deemed classic, but too old to feel fresh. That was Dig Dug standing in 1986 in a nutshell, and in fact where most of the 7800's launch games really were. This cartridge is a great and highly playable adaptation of the arcade original, but its omnipresence on home systems throughout the 80s means it also suffered from a sensation of been there, done that at the time this cart hit the market. The 7800 rendition of the game offered incremental improvements over other available home ports, but it still wasn't a dead ringer for the arcade upright. It feels crunched down and abstracted. But with all that said, it's still a great conversion of a great game. It might have been less exciting in 1986 than something like Duck Hunt or Super Mario Bros., but in hindsight, it's one of the best vintage releases of Namco's masterpiece.
Our third 7800 launch game this episode is another Namco arcade classic, and as we'd see with Lynx a few years later, it's a conversion of Ms. Pac-Man. It's probably worth mentioning at this point that Atari and Namco actually had a really close relationship.
It wasn't always friendly, more like frenemies, with a financial element to further complicate things. Namco bought a portion of Atari games when the original Atari split into two, giving the mistake of the American arcade manufacturer. Atari Games wasn't the Atari behind the 7800, that was Atari Corp., but the two entities remained more or less in cahoots until they splintered, dissolved, or were bought out by competitors in the late 80s and early 90s. Atari had a lock on home licenses of Namco's big arcade hits in the early 80s, releasing them for non-Atari platforms including Apple II and ColecoVision under the Atari Soft label. These early 7800 releases, holdovers from the intended 1984 launch, encompassed many of the titles that fell under the Atari Soft brand. The years leading up to the 7800's arrival at retailers were filled with speculation that the system's delay had to do with licensing concerns. When Atari Inc. splintered into Atari Corp. And Atari Games, the Atari Soft brand was discontinued and the rights to its licenses reverted. And many of those same licenses, especially for Namco titles, comprised the bulk of early 7800 releases. Well, clearly things worked out behind the scenes because those familiar arcade creations showed up here on 7800 at the very outset. And, as we've seen, they were pretty solid. As with Dig Dug, Ms. Pac-Man for 7800 isn't visually quite as faithful an interpretation of the arcade material as its NES counterpart. But also as with Dig Dug, that was irrelevant for NES owners in 1986. Ms. Pac-Man wouldn't hit NES until 1990, and that was an unlicensed version by Atari's own label Tengen. The Namco-published release wouldn't arrive until 1993. So points to Atari's 7800 for bringing a top-notch rendition of the game to the market long before the competition. Ms. Pac-Man on 7800 is an incremental improvement over the US home releases that preceded it. Slightly better looking than the Atari 5200 home computer versions, though not enough so to be an immediate system seller. More compelling was the prospect of playing the game with a decent joystick, as opposed to the 5200's horrible, non-centering analog thing. The superior 7800 stick made this Ms. Pac-Man a far cry more responsive than a previous Atari renditions, even though the joystick, as I've mentioned before, wasn't properly gated to restrict movements to cardinal directions. But you take what you get. Visually, it shares its sprite and maze design with older Atari and Atari Soft renditions. The monsters have the same boxy look to them, and the pellets Ms. Pac-Man devours are square-shaped. The differences between these versions are pretty subtle. The 7800's is slightly more colorful and the sound is a little better. Like other Atari interpretations of Ms. Pac-Man, this version includes a difficulty selection option based on the first in-stage bonus item you see. Cherry difficulty kicks you off at the first stage of the arcade game, while the highest banana difficulty selection takes you well into Act 2 to a point where eating an Energizer capsule makes the monsters vulnerable for just a couple of seconds. You also have Atari's standard, optional super easy setting, Teddy Bear, which moves at what feels like half speed. There's something terribly bizarre about Ms. Pac-Man eating a teddy bear, not to mention only getting 50 points for snagging a bonus item. It's this easy mode option that lumps Ms. Pac-Man for 7800 in with Atari Soft ports rather than the later Tengen releases. On Lynx, NES, and Genesis, Ms. Pac-Man came with totally different remixed modes. Here the mazes are simply faithful adaptations of the ones seen in the arcade, and enemy logic works as you would expect, which is to say it's a very good rendition of Ms. Pac-Man, a slight improvement over previous Atari releases. It's nice, but once again, it's hardly a system seller.
And to wrap up this episode, finally, a game not from Namco. It's Williams' Joust, although Like Ms. Pac-Man and Dig Dug and Pole Position 2, this game also originated in the arcades in the early 80s.
Joust was a big hit in arcades for Williams, one of the first multiplayer games to blur the line between cooperative and competitive play. It was a huge influence on two NES releases that would show up just weeks after the 7800's launch, Mario Bros. And Balloon Fight. Balloon Fight is the more direct descendant, of course, as it involves aerial maneuvers and striking opponents from above. Balloon Fight is a slower, gentler game than Joust, as befits its home console heritage, but the influence of Joust is undeniable. Balloon Fight was developed by Satoru Iwata of HAL, who had previously helped Nintendo pitch the NES to Atari by coding spec versions of several arcade hits, including Joust. That version of Joust would eventually come out for NES in 1988, with enormous character sprites, a strange title screen, and a faithful recreation of the arcade game's sense of inertia. Joust on 7800, on the other hand, looks more like the arcade version, but plays faster and looser, with more responsive flight controls that make it easier to flap around and dodge enemies. It is, hands down, the most enjoyable 8-bit rendition of Joust, period. As with the other games here, its visuals have a sort of abstracted quality due to the 7800's default resolution of 160 by 200, quite a bit lower than that of competing systems in the late 80s. But even if the 7800's graphical tech results in a look that calls to mind the Lynx and its miserly resolution, Joust still looks and plays great here. This home conversion neatly recaptures all the details of the arcade game. The bridges burning away after round 2, the survival and egg waves, the roaming pterodactyl who appears to wipe out slowpoke players, the dissolving platforms, the different tiers of buzzard riders. There's no getting around the fact that Joust was several years old by this point and had been seen on countless other home systems already. Again, it was not a game to set the world on fire in 1986, but it's a strong conversion of an arcade classic, like everything initially released for 7800.
As we'd see with Lynx a few years later, Atari 7800 was initially kind of a one-note platform, but to its credit, it sang that one note like a maestro.